So yeah, my name's Emily Howbrook. I do work at Eastleigh Council at the moment. My presentation is more about the planning profession and how you get into that profession. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk about working in planning. So what is planning? So yeah, I thought I'd start from sort of first principles. So the definition that I found was that the purpose of the planning system is to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development, and I assume lots of your students will have heard that phrase, sustainable development. It's been around for many years now, and that's quite an all-encompassing definition, and I hope today what I will show to you is that planning is really important to sustainable development, but it does touch on lots of different elements that make up sustainability, and it's a very broad subject area. At a sort of practical level, there are over 300 councils in England, and they all have what we call planning functions. So if you want to get a job in a local planning authority, there are over 300 councils across the country that you can go and see if they've got any jobs. So I think it's fair to say it is a sort of a good sector for seeing what jobs are available. So what the planning authority does at the council level is they determine, so they decide planning applications. So if anyone has put in a planning application in their household, for example, an extension or an office in the garden during these different times, for example, you'll be familiar that you have to put that application in to your local authority for them to determine that. But apart from just looking at sort of small scale bits of development, we also look actually through planning policy sort of 20 to 30 years ahead about what the community needs. So yes, it is about sort of small scale changes in the environment, such as just some work to your house, right through to whole scale changes to the environment, so very broad. In terms of what planners do, as again, I think Lloyd mentioned about looking at place and people, and that's a theme I'm going to touch on again. And this definition from the Royal Town Planning Institute talks about planners helping to find solutions to issues. And another thing that comes through strongly is that the government does ask the planning sector to pick up on quite a few issues, from housing right through to climate change. So if you have an interest in sort of government issues, it's likely that planning would touch on that. But it has been around many, many years since we first started building things. So as I mentioned, the exciting thing about planning is it does cover lots of different disciplines and areas, and I've listed a few there. So myself, I've worked in regeneration, I've worked in economic development, and I'm currently working in housing strategy. But I did spend 7 years at Hampshire County Council doing infrastructure and waste planning. So there's lots of interchangeable skills, and it really does depend what kind of floats your boat. So I've never done anything around rural planning particularly, because I've never worked in a rural authority, and that's quite a specialist area, working with farmers and things. And I also haven't worked in an area that's had particularly strong heritage, so I wouldn't say that was my strong area. I've worked more in urban authorities, so done a bit of urban design and so on, and housing strategy. So again, it depends kind of which area you do your planning in, where you focus in the different areas here. So yeah, as I say, the Royal Town Planning Institute is the institute that looks after planners in this country, and they, again, in their definition, they emphasise a lot about this role, and this sector is about places and building places and what we call place shaping, and also people. So you can't expect to plan for change in a community really without involving local people and stakeholders, and there's a few listed there. So as I mentioned, the government does expect planning authorities and planners to be aware and pick up on a lot of issues affecting us. And here's a list here of some examples of why we do need planners. So right from sort of just planning local neighbourhoods and streets and checking what the applicant is putting forward is acceptable, that's a key part, but right through to actually taking action on climate change and looking at flood risk and zoning and where would be a good place to put new development. So right from the kind of micro level through to big strategic issues. So you'll notice that Lloyd and myself both have strategy in our titles. And I think, as Lloyd explained, that's because there is often no wrong or right answer, and a lot of what our job is to balance up the different issues and explain those implications to decision makers. That seems very vague, But for example, the work that I do on housing at the moment looks at our housing needs locally. I work at Eastleigh, as I said, so I look at Eastleigh Borough's housing needs and I make recommendations about how we could address those through different build programmes. So what you may be interested in with all this kind of theoretical talk is what we actually do on the job. So I thought I'd list some things there. So I do quite a lot of reports writing, which get put in the public domain, as I say, because we help decision makers at Eastleigh make their decisions. We also do a lot of research and evidence studies. So yeah, I've done a lot of report writing in my time. We also use our negotiation skills and so on to help make the case for change, because with sustainability and changing places, projections, climate change, population change, demographic change, etc., the community and the world's always changing. So how the authority or how a business who does planning responds to that is an important part of what we do. The government will also introduce new policies all the time. The planning system has changed a lot since I've been in it. So you have to be able to sort of keep up to speed with what those policies are. Analysing statistics, so looking at data locally and interpreting what that means is important. Evaluating sites, that's about having a look at either a greenfield or a brownfield piece of land, so that's an undeveloped site, such as a field, or a previously developed site, and evaluating that and thinking, what could that work for in the local area? Is that suitable for housing? Is that suitable for employment land, for example? And so on and so forth. I've mentioned development management at the end. That is the catch-all term for making planning applications and decisions. So if you work in planning for a council and you have planning applications that you deal with, you'll be working in development management. Okay, so here's just some visuals talking about what I mentioned about different policies. So the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government has actually just changed its name. I think it's Department of Levelling Up, Housing, Communities and Local Government, but essentially planning does sit at the national level and they do produce design guides, planning practice and policies that we have to be familiar with. But we also, down at the local level, have our local plan that will soon be adopted by Eastleigh, and as you can see, that looks 20 years ahead into the future in terms of what development needs the borough needs. And then finally, I've put on here just an example of a development brief which looks at the very local level. This one was written by the council before my time, I think it was 2012. There was a piece of land that it had an interest in that was suitable for development, and the council wanted to shape what that development looked like. And I'm just going to use that as an example to show you how that translates from policy and vision through to delivery. So that land at Hatch Farm, here's the site here. It's in West End, near Barbaker Avenue, as you can see, near Barnesland area. If anyone knows that area, you may be familiar. So what the team did, that document I mentioned is a quite hefty document, but one of the key visuals from that is looking at the constraints and opportunities. And when I say we evaluate sites, this is an example of what I mean. So you use a lot of mapping skills to understand the topography of the land, the views coming in, how the sunlight lands on the orientation of the site. What else we've got here? Flood zones, etc., etc. And its proximity to existing facilities. So you need to really understand how the site fits in with its surroundings when you start to evaluate a site. So that was done, and the team designed a vision for how dense and the layout and what they thought would work. So like I say, that was in 2012. And skipping to the end, essentially that's been built now. So I took this photo in March 2020. This site is now called The Willows. It's been built out and people are living there. And it was developed alongside the planning authority's aspirations, which, you know, it's just an example of how a vision and kind of putting pen to paper can translate to the built environment. Planning is about understanding the vision and aims of the people that are making the decisions. So a lot of the time it is our councillors, that's who we're employed by, local councillors, working with the community. So what's the visions and aims for a place? Then you've got other people in the planning sector and in the industry who will design those aims for you and to show you what it could look like. And then if those are acceptable to the planning authority, you'll get permissions, and the permissions enable you to start planning for delivery. So delivery is very much the realm that Lloyd was talking about previously. We have already started, building roads and looking at unlocking the land at One Horton Heath. So that's at the delivery stage, and it did recently get approval for its outline permission. So as I say, the permissions take a while, but we get there in the end. And finally, even when things are delivered, the planning authority still has a role monitoring. So there are also jobs in monitoring and enforcement at councils, which is basically to check that things are being built the way that they said they were going to be. So I've mentioned a lot about councils today. I have my whole career in planning authorities for councils. I've worked at 3 different councils, including Hampshire, which I've listed there. But planners work all over the country. They also work in other countries. So a lot of other countries have a similar planning system to us, for example, New Zealand. So some people go and work over there. You can work in central government, as I've mentioned. Charities work with planners. Lots of house builders and developers have their own planners or work with planning firms. Architects quite like to have planners employed as well to put their applications in for them when they get jobs. So there's private practice and consultancy specialising in all the different types of planning that I mentioned at the outset. So lots of different places you can work, not just the council. And here's a visual which I got from the Royal Town Planning Institute's guide about how to get into planning. And that just, I think, demonstrates what I've been saying about the different types of planning and where you can work. So the orange is that development management that I mentioned. So most planners are working for the planning authority and looking at planning applications. But again, that, based on this visual, that's only 38%, and there's loads of other jobs doing all different types of other planning. So I've listed some skills in terms of what kind of person would like to go into planning and what skills are needed. It's very much a diverse team. There's not a kind of one size fits all, but I've listed here a few skills. And I mentioned political awareness, which essentially just means being aware of the people you're working for. If you're working for a council, it will be your local councillors or local members, and they will have a specific political approach to planning. Are they pro-house building or not, for example? This is just a visual to articulate my point about working with others, which is a key skill. So this is quite a caricature, and you'll see quite a few of these online. So they sort of suggest here that the planner is very much the kind of checking and measuring that the tree's been looked after the right way. But as you can see, we have to be able to work with all different types of people with different motivations and coming from the built environment from a different angle. And that, I would say, in my experience, is a really big skill that's needed to be able to kind of talk cross-language with different professionals. Okay, so I think this is my final slide. I've mentioned the Royal Town Planning Institute before. I am a chartered planner. I've been so for over 10 years. And there's a route to becoming that, which the RTPI have brilliant guidance on. So that's the professional body. Lee and others will talk about work experience, and I definitely support that. Definitely contact a local council if you want to get some work experience in planning. And I think the key point to finish on is that with this career, as I mentioned before about the different changes in the sector, is that we have to keep learning, and a key part of being a chartered planner is that you have to record your continuous learning and demonstrate that at any time, that actually you are keeping sort of up to date with different policies, different practice, and that you're pushing yourself to learn and become a better planner.
Quite often there is a person or something that inspires you. That's sort of like when we talk, Andy, when we're in schools and we talk to young people, don't we, about what is it that lights the fire in your belly? What was that moment where you suddenly thought, this is what I want to do? So I sort of wanted to ask Emily, really, was there somebody or something that made you decide, yes, this is definitely what I want to do?
I did get into planning really quite young, so I was 22 when I, seems quite young now, when I got my first assistant planning role, and I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I was working in a council that covered Aldershot and Farnborough, and it's just a really interesting area. I was living in Eastleigh, so it was quite a commute, but it was sort of ex-military land, and we worked with the MOD, and they were regenerating their town centres, and I thought, wow, in such a small space, just 2 little towns, there's a hell of a lot going on. We sort of had, things going around about habitats that needed protecting and ground nesting birds, and I think I just thought this will keep me busy. Just threw myself into that, and the people that supported me in that council were just fantastic, and I just didn't want to do anything else after that, really. So one of the routes is essentially the number of years you've got working in planning. So I have known people that have kind of had 10 years under their belt. They sort of done some technical stuff around planning and then sort of became a planning officer from kind of on the job training, and then they can apply based on demonstrating to the RTPI that they have got the experience. So that's one route. There are other routes. The route that I took was I did a part-time planning accredited course at Oxford Brookes University. That took 2 years, and then after you finish your accredited degree, you basically do a couple of years of sort of logbooking and doing various bits of learning, and then you apply. So it's quite a it's quite a lot of work to do it, but it took me about 3 years all in all. You can apply once you've got your degree or your relevant experience. You can apply at any time, and the RTPI have got loads of good guidance about how to do that. So it may be different now. When I did it about 10 years ago, and I think, I don't think it's changed too much. It's no exams. We had to do a personal development plan. So you have to show the RTPI that you understand what the attributes of being a good and ethical planner are, and that you've got experience of doing those, and you've reflected on your practice, and your strengths, your weaknesses, and you know which elements of planning you want to grow into, and you have a plan for how you're going to do that. So that's what you need to show them, that as I said, no one's the complete package. But it's knowing the route and where you want to get different experiences and how you're going to get those. For example, other courses you might go on, or on the job training. So my advice on that is to get familiar with kind of what the different councils do. So as a local example, Portsmouth and Southampton are unitary councils, so they do the lot. They don't have different tiers, so they would do transport. Eastleigh we have one sustainable transport officer, but the highway planning function for Eastleigh is covered by Hampshire, and they have a massive environment department with whole transport teams and everything. So once you kind of know where that sits, it's a case of getting some work experience or looking at jobs that come up. But the good thing about, for example, transport planning is you can go in at a very quite junior level and work your way up. Yeah, I think in the video that we've got online, I talk about understanding very much the local level, so neighbourhood groups or residents associations or maybe the parish council, and just understand how they look at change in the built environment at a very local level. Organisations like parish councils are usually very open to having a conversation with people and just getting familiar with local issues in your area. I think that would be my first piece of advice, and just finding out about what it is about the built environment that interests you.
And you can go on, can't you, and look at some of the meetings that we've got on the council website, so you can play those back. I was saying that in the previous sort of talk, that you can go in and then listen about how decisions are made, because that's quite interesting as well.
Yeah, so all planning authorities have a committee that decides certain applications that are either sort of big enough or controversial enough to be decided by committee. And so that's public, completely public meeting, so you can come along and you can see the planning officer present the case, present their recommendation and see how that's debated. So yeah, that's another really good hands-on experience that you can get.